Prince William has just taken control of one of Britain's most valuable private estates, and according to reports, one of the first things that changed was Camilla's family presence inside it. For years, Camilla's younger sister Annabel Elliot worked for the Duchy of Cornwall. Then William became Duke of Cornwall, and Annabel's name disappeared from the estate's payroll. That might sound like a routine staffing change. It wasn't, because the duchy is not just another royal property. It is a billion-dollar estate tied directly to the heir to the throne. And the moment William inherited control, he gained something Camilla could never control: financial independence from the king. Now there is an even bigger question. What happens to Camilla's homes when Charles is gone? Because some of the properties she currently lives in will eventually belong to William, and that is where this story becomes far more personal. Let's go back to the moment everything changed. On September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle. Charles immediately became king. And in that same moment, William automatically became Duke of Cornwall. With that title came control of the Duchy of Cornwall, an estate created in 1337 for the eldest son of the monarch. The duchy covers roughly 135,000 acres across England and Wales and includes farms, tenant properties, holiday cottages, historic sites, investments, and the Isles of Scilly. By 2025, the estate was generating tens of millions of dollars a year for William, but the most important part was not the money, it was independence. The duchy was designed centuries ago so the heir could have his own financial base without depending entirely on the reigning monarch. That meant William was no longer simply Charles's son. Financially, he had his own machine, and that machine had previously funded Charles's life for decades when Charles himself was Duke of Cornwall. Now control had moved from father to son, and inside that estate was one person whose position suddenly looked very different: Annabel Elliot. Camilla's younger sister had been hired in 2005 to work as an interior designer on duchy properties. For almost 2 decades, she worked on cottages, estates, and other properties connected to the duchy. Her work was reportedly well regarded, but when William took over, the arrangement ended. The duchy's accounts later showed that Annabel was no longer on the payroll. There was no dramatic announcement, no public confrontation, just a name that disappeared. And that silence is exactly what made the change so interesting, because it happened at the beginning of a much bigger transition. Charles's era was slowly giving way to William's. There is one detail about the duchy that makes that transition even more significant. The estate is not simply a collection of grand houses. It is a working business containing agricultural land, commercial property, residential property, tourism assets, and investments. William's authority is therefore practical, not ceremonial. He can decide who works there, how it is managed, and which old arrangements continue into the next generation. That is why Annabel's departure attracted so much attention. For years, her work appeared across duchy properties. She worked on holiday cottages on the Isles of Scilly, properties connected to Restormel Castle, the Welsh estate at Wynnewermod, and a guest accommodation project at Dumfries House. In 2014, she was reportedly ranked among Britain's most influential female interior designers, so this was not necessarily a case of an inexperienced relative being given a meaningless role. Annabel had a real professional career, and that actually makes William's decision more interesting. He did not need to prove that her work was bad. He only needed to decide that the duchy should operate differently under his leadership. That distinction is crucial. The story becomes much more powerful when you stop looking at it as a simple family feud. It is really about succession. Charles spent decades building the duchy around his priorities. William inherited it and became responsible for shaping it around his. That is exactly what happens when one generation of the monarchy gives way to another. But to understand why people are reading so much into this, we need to understand the history behind William and Camilla. Before Charles married Camilla in 2005, William and Harry reportedly asked their father to avoid marriage and simply remain with Camilla. Harry later described that conversation in Spare. The brothers were willing to accept Camilla as part of their father's life, but marriage was different. They knew what it would mean for their mother's legacy and for the public conversation surrounding Diana. Charles married Camilla anyway. For years, the public was told that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. That changed in 2022. Queen Elizabeth publicly expressed her wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. Then Charles was crowned in 2023, and Camilla was ultimately presented simply as Queen Camilla. For some royal watchers, that was the final step in a transformation they had been watching for years. For William, it meant something more complicated. He had grown up with the consequences of his parents' marriage breakdown. He had watched his mother struggle under the pressure surrounding Charles and Camilla, and he had lived through the loss of Diana. That history makes every future interaction between William and Camilla unusually sensitive, but there was another layer. Camilla's influence inside the royal system has become a recurring subject of royal commentary. Some biographies and reports have portrayed her as someone who developed strong relationships with journalists and exercised influence behind the scenes. There have also been claims that palace communications contributed to damaging stories involving William, Catherine, Harry, and Meghan. Those claims are disputed, and they should be treated as allegations rather than established fact. But whether every story is true or not, the perception of competing royal camps has become one of the defining tensions of the modern monarchy. And that brings us back to Annabel. Because her position was not merely professional, she was Camilla's sister. She had been working inside an estate that was now controlled by William. And William had every right, as Duke of Cornwall, to decide how the duchy should be managed. The result was striking. Annabel was out, and William began bringing people from his own circle into important positions around the duchy. The symbolism was obvious: a new duke, a new team, a new way of doing business. Financially, Annabel's salary was small compared with the value of the duchy, but politically and symbolically the change was much bigger. It suggested that William was willing to separate the estate from the personal networks that had surrounded his father. And that may be the most important clue in the entire story. William wasn't simply inheriting property, he was inheriting a system, and he was changing it. There was another moment that fueled the perception of a family standoff. Reports have said that Camilla invited her son Tom Parker Bowles to Christmas at Sandringham. William reportedly chose not to attend the main gathering and instead spent Christmas with Catherine and their children at Anmer Hall. Tom later confirmed that Camilla had invited him because she had not spent Christmas with him in a long time. Again, the details matter. This does not prove a personal war between William and Camilla, but it does show how complicated the royal family's private relationships can become when family tradition, royal protocol, and personal loyalties collide. And then there is the question that matters most. Where does Camilla actually stand after Charles? Right now, she is queen. She has official duties, royal residences, and the protection that comes with being the king's wife, but her position is fundamentally connected to Charles. When Charles dies, William becomes king, Catherine becomes queen, and Camilla's role changes automatically. She would become the widow of the former king, commonly described as Queen Dowager. But the biggest issue is not the title, it is property. Because some of the most important royal residences Camilla currently uses are privately owned by the monarch. Sandringham House and Balmoral Castle are not government properties. They are private royal estates. Elizabeth inherited them from her father, George VI. When Elizabeth died, they passed to Charles. When Charles eventually dies, they are expected to pass to William. That means the man who now controls the Duchy of Cornwall will eventually control these homes as well. And this is where Camilla's personal situation becomes much more complicated. For William, Balmoral is not simply an asset worth millions. In 1997, William and Harry were at Balmoral when their father told them that Diana had died. The estate therefore carries memories that go far beyond royal ceremony. And yet Camilla now appears there as queen, part of the same royal household surrounding the aftermath of Diana's death. That does not prove William wants her removed, but it explains why these properties can never be emotionally neutral for him. They are part of his history, and one day they will be his. There is also a major difference between Charles and William that matters here. Charles spent decades as heir before becoming king. William has spent much of his adult life watching the consequences of the choices made during that era. Now he has the authority to build something different. That is why staffing changes inside the duchy can matter more than they appear to. A single employee leaving is not a constitutional crisis, but dozens of small decisions can reveal the direction of an entire reign. Who works for the heir? Who advises him? Who manages his property? Which traditions survive? Which relationships remain close? Those are the questions that eventually shape a royal court, and William has already begun answering some of them. But there is one more detail that makes Camilla's future especially interesting. She once had a private home that was completely her own, Raymill House in Wiltshire. It was her retreat before and during her royal life, a place associated with privacy and personal freedom, but she sold it after committing more fully to her life with Charles. That decision may not have seemed significant at the time. Today it looks very different. Because if Camilla does not retain another privately owned residence, her long-term housing arrangements could depend heavily on what the next king decides. That does not mean William will throw her out. There is no evidence that he has announced such a plan, and it would be irresponsible to present that as a confirmed fact. But the legal reality is still important. The properties will belong to William. The future arrangements will ultimately be shaped by him. And that is why the duchy story matters so much. The removal of Annabel Elliot was not proof of revenge. It was not proof that William is planning to punish Camilla, but it was a clear example of William exercising his own authority over an estate that had previously been managed by his father. And once you see that, the bigger picture becomes impossible to ignore. William is no longer waiting for his reign to begin. He is already building the machinery of it, his own staff, his own priorities, his own financial structure, his own relationship with the monarchy, and that is something Camilla cannot stop. Because the transition from Charles to William is not a future event anymore, it has already started. Every time William changes the duchy, he is practicing for kingship. Every time he chooses his own people, he is establishing his own court. Every time an old arrangement disappears, the structure around the next reign becomes clearer, and eventually Charles will no longer be king. When that day comes, William will inherit the crown, the private estates, and the enormous responsibilities that come with them. Camilla will still be part of the family, she will still have a place in royal life, but her position will no longer be defined by being the king's wife. It will be defined by what the new king decides, and that is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. For decades, Camilla moved closer and closer to the center of royal power. She went from being Charles's partner to his wife, from controversial figure to queen, from outsider to one of the most visible women in the monarchy. But power inside the royal family has always been temporary. Kings change, titles change, residences change hands. And eventually the person standing at the center changes too. William's control of the Duchy of Cornwall was the first major reminder that the next era is already being built. Annabel Elliot's departure was one small piece of that transition. The future of Sandringham and Balmoral is another, and the future of Camilla herself may be the biggest question of all. Because when Charles is gone, the woman who spent decades building a life beside him will have to live under a new royal order, an order led by William. And William has already shown that when something belongs to him, he is willing to make his own decisions. So the real question is not whether William can change Camilla's world, he already has. The real question is how much more will change when he finally becomes king,